We had 3 breakout room inquiries on the table. How does how does Van Sertima articulate his thesis? How does this cultural confluence complicate the common understandings of history? And then how does this cultural confluence problematize normative understandings of race relations between the Black and brown community? Who would like to share what was discussed in their breakout room? Go ahead. Go ahead. No, go ahead, Tony. Go for it.
I was gonna ask, can you clarify question 3, please?
3.
I'm a little.
Okay. So typically, right, when you talk about Black and brown relations or how those 2 communities interact with one another, they're typically told from the standpoints of tensions, of divisions, of beefs, of rifts, right? The story that Van Sertima tells of these 2 communities, African and indigenous, coming together, it disturbs that normative understanding of these 2 communities' relations. How does it do that? Does that make more sense for you, Carney?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. You want me to start, or
if you like, it's up to you. If you want to. If not, I could go to, because Destiny had her hand up too. So
okay, I'll Destiny could go ahead.
Okay, Destiny, go ahead, please.
Okay, hi. I'm sorry if it's a little wind. It's like a little noisy over here because it's pretty windy outside. So I was gonna answer question 2. So what I wrote was cultural confluences highlighted by I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
Van Sertima.
Sertima. Disrupted a common understanding of history because since there's so much proof of the Mandingo traders that they were there first, proving like that they were there first and not someone we were all taught in school over and over again. It was kind of drilled into our brains that he came first, but in reality it was the others that came first. But we were taught over and over again and we couldn't really understand really what was going on.
Yeah, and I think also, Destiny, is one great call out, but 2, it's twofold, right? One, it disturbs the normative understanding of the discovery of America, and then also disturbs the normative understanding of African people's historical connection with this country as well, right? It's not just through the process of enslavement that they had contact with the Americans. Who else would like to share what was discussed in their breakout rooms? You could volunteer, you could be voluntold. It's up to you.
I could go ahead. I'll do the first one.
Okay.
The way he articulates his thesis. It's very interesting. I feel like I don't know how to really say how he expresses information, but not that he writes in a way where the reader it's almost like the reader's gonna be doesn't need to be told what to believe. You know, it's like it's literally evidence after evidence with a logical conclusion that the reader has to make on their own.
Yes.
And it's a very nice way of reading. At first, the first couple pages, I was kind of confused. I didn't know really where it was going. I guess because it's like a snippet, like it's a, it's like a part of a whole book. I looked it up and stuff. But yeah, but it was very interesting how the information is provided, and it's, it honestly just changes your thoughts on history and what you're like kind of taught like in school. I mean, I was taught, Christopher Columbus, came here first person, but like now it's like, wait, hold on. Like there's rituals that they have similarities in. They have like items / artifacts that they have similarities in, and language, which is like really mind-blowing, because even though it's like different, it's like off by like one letter or pronunciation. It's almost like the same exact word, different pronunciation, and it almost means the same exact thing. And that's just mind-boggling on its own.
Yeah. So if I can kind of paraphrase what Carney has mentioned, because I think you're spot on, right? One, how he goes about articulating his thesis. It's not that this is my position I need you to come on to my position, right? I'm just going to present you information after information after information, historical evidence after historical evidence, right? Factual evidence, factual evidence, factual evidence. And with this material, you could decide the truth for yourself, right? Another thing that Carney mentions, and I think this also pertains to how he delivers this method, is he's looking at these very significant aspects of culture, right? Religion, customs, right? Attire, like how they dress, and then most importantly, language, right? This is how, through those four subject matters, right? This is how Van Sertima articulates his thesis. He's like, well, you can see from the language that there's a shared cultural confluence from the language between these two communities. You can see by the religious practices that there's a shared cultural confluence, right? You can see through the way that they dress, there's a shared cultural confluence, right? So he's looking at these aspects of culture and sharing and seeing and being attentive to how they come together. And through that attentiveness, the reader is allowed to make it a decision as to what they feel the conclusion is. Michelle, if you could do me a favor, would you mind articulating what you put in the chat out loud, please? I'm talking to Michelle Martin, because I know it's two of y'all.
Hi, Professor, can you hear me? I'm wearing headphones. I don't know if I sound muffled.
No, you're good.
But yeah, so relating to what Carney said about how the thesis, how he articulates his thesis, he doesn't like really try to like persuade you or anything. He just like describes the facts and like kind of lets the reader decide like how these two groups are very similar. And not only like religion, he talks about like, I'm just going off of what he said, like different artifacts, different languages, they're all similar. And he kind of says how there is like a part in the text where he says like, let me look for it. Hold on. Well, the way he says like, how did he describe it? Like a skeleton? Like they use the same framework of like African origins. And I guess it's like building up, it's just going back and forth between those ideas.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'll do then is I'll jump into my notes, and then from there we'll move into our fishbowl. Carney is absolutely right. This is a chapter from a book titled They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in the Ancient Americas. And the author is Ivan Van Sertima. In fact, if you think back to the first week of the semester and we watched the, I don't know, did I show that to you? I don't think y'all saw that video, but I had some slides from his work in that first video. In that first lecture of the first week of class. So we're going to jump into it. We know that the title of the chapter that we read was The Mandingo Traders in Medieval Mexico. And he says that these Black merchants from the hot lands, they sold vivid colored mantles of cloth, cotton, and then together with these garments, they brought into the marketplace golden ear pendants and smoking pipes, right? And then he also mentions that, how they begin to trickle their way into the area. At first they come in twos and then a small band, right? And then Van Sertima also mentions that some of the luxuries that they offered in the marketplace had only been enjoyed, he says exclusively been enjoyed by the royalty, by the nobility, right? So they're able to make some of those things that were only enjoyed by the royalty available to the masses, okay? He says these strangers had in their passage to Mexico from some settlement in the South, picked up Nacanal, I believe is how you pronounce that, the lingua franca of the Aztecs, but they spoke it as a second language or a second tongue, for several of their words were clearly not of that language. So essentially what he's saying is, right, they recognize that these Africans are coming from somewhere from the South, and on their travels from the South north, they notice that they're speaking the language of the Aztecs, right? But they're also attempting the fact like, yeah, they're speaking this Aztec language, but there's other words that are being infused and used with this language that lets us know that this Aztec language is not their first tongue, okay? So they're bilingual, so to speak. And then they mention as they begin to come into this area, they built a temple in the town as soon as they had a sizable capuli, right? And a capuli is just a sizable community is a way to think about that, right? So once they were able to establish a sizable community, then they built temples, right? Think back to the first week's lecture. You've seen the pyramids built, you've seen those temples built, right? So you see the same cultural continuity that was going on in ancient Kemet being conducted in the Americas under these Mali travelers, right? And he says that in the front court of the temple, they set up the wooden statue of a werewolf who was their Nakanyao, right? So, or who was their god or who was their deity. It says it was not long before, it was not long before they were drawn also to the Afrikans Nakanyao and begin to join in their rituals and festivities, right? So another part of how Van Sertima delivers this thesis is a narration, right? He's telling a story of someone observing the presence of these African people coming into into Mexico, right? And he says that as they're observing these African people build temples, right, and practice their rituals, the indigenous people of the Americas are watching this and they're becoming interested, right? So they allow them to participate in their ritual. So again, you're seeing the cultural confluence. Now, I want you all to think back to last week's reading. The destruction of Black civilization. There's a vast similarity in how this migration, if you will, is taking place between how Chancellor Williams from last week talks about how the Arabs and the Asians came into Africa, right? There's very vast similarities between that occurrence and how Africans are coming into the Americas, right? While there's vast similarities, the after effects are vastly different, right? When Europeans, when Asians and Arabs came into Africa, it was more of a conquering and a conquest type of feel to it. Yet when the Africans came to the Americas, they allowed the participation of the two communities in the two cultural differences. They allowed them to participate in their cultural happenings, in their cultural events, right? Whereas when you look at with the Europeans, they forced Christianity on Africans, right? Where here you don't see that. The indigenous people were interested in the practices that the African people were exhibiting, and the African people allowed them to participate in their rituals, right? So I bring this up to disturb this notion that when groups migrate, when groups travel and they come into contact with other groups, right, you have to conquer that group, right? Because if you read a certain telling of history, you would think that this is the only way that migration happened is through conquest. And I believe Van Sertima does a phenomenal job of letting you know that that's not necessarily the case when you look at history, right? So I want you all to be attentive to that. So also thinking about last week's reading, thinking about how the Asian community in particular would marry into these African communities, right? And they would use these marriages to work their way into the nobility of the community, and also use the mixed offsprings to further enslave the Africans, right? But look at how the Africans and the indigenous people merge, right? So they say they were daughters of the feather workers who had been to wife by the Blacks, right? So the feather workers, the indigenous people, are allowing their daughters to marry the Africans, right? Thus, had the gods and the rituals of the natives and the forms of the Pocheca, excuse me, and the Amateca slowly fused, right? So not only did they merge their religious rituals, not only were they engaging in trade, but they're also intermixing the cultures by marriages as well, right? Then he goes on to say, it is with Mexico, however, that we are most concerned. For here we can see that the confluence of the cultures, not just the confluence of blood. So let's unpack that, right? So he's saying first and foremost that this cultural confluence took place all over the Western Hemisphere, right? If you were to look into South America, you would find it. If you look into Central America, you would find it. But we're most concerned with Mexico because you can not only see the confluence of blood, right? Not only do you see the mixing through marriage, but you see the mixture of culture, more important, right? And he says, if you are to compare the coat of the werewolf from the Amateca with the coat of the werewolf found among the Bambara of Mali, we are at the heart of this confluence, right? So the way that the Amateca worship this werewolf god is in direct alignment with how the Bambara of Mali worship this werewolf god, excuse me. And Van Sertima says that right there is at the heart of this cultural confluence. And then he goes through the work of Dr. Alfonso de Gray, and he says that this Dr. Alfonso, he did very extensive research, and he found that the same sickle cell gene that is predominantly in African people would be found in a lot of the indigenous people in this area of Mexico. And he says that oftentimes that sickle cell gene that is in the Africans is because of malaria. So they developed this natural resistance to fight off malaria. And he says it's not happenstance that same gene is found within the people of Mexico, right? And he's saying that is due to the mixing of the blood, right? Give me 1 second, I'm gonna pull something up on the internet real quick. So in the book, he also talks about the god Ekchua, I believe is how you pronounce that, or the beekeeper god. Is anybody from Mexico familiar with that god, Ekchua? And if you are, let me know how to pronounce it if I'm fucking that up. You know anyone familiar? All right, let me show you an image of this guy. And he says that for the Mandingos, they viewed him as the beekeeper god. For the indigenous people, they viewed it as the god of trade, right? And if you look how he's depicted, as they mentioned, very black skin, not even brown skinned, but black skin. Again, looking at the cloak on his shoulders, right? These are all very African in their origin. He talks about the spear that he carries, right? So again, speaking to this cultural confluence. Read a quick passage. All right. So I'm gonna look at page, I'm looking at page 101, the second full paragraph. And it says the relationship may now be seen very clearly between the Amateca of Mexico and the Amatigi or Namantigi of Mali. The worship of the werewolf totem, or Nagao, underwent very few changes, indeed in its transplantation from Mali to Mexico. As in all transplantations, local fauna and material simply replaced the original. The hyena became the coyote. The stick knob with sheep's horns became the stick knob with black stones. The bright tropical birds of Africa had their feathers matched by the rich plumes of the South American quetzalcoatl bird. But the basic complex of ideas and their unique organization remained behind as skeletal evidence of their African origin. I believe this is what Michelle was talking about earlier, right? This is the passage thing that she was trying to pull from. And finally, this idea that, especially when you're looking at, to Carney's point, right, looking at how Van Sertima uses language and etymology and the root words to speak to this cultural confluence. But then he makes this cautionary observation, right? Like, if you're looking at how all these root words have Islamic origin, don't allow that to fool you to believe that these folks coming from Mali fully bought into Islam, right? He's saying that Islam was more used by these folks from Mali as a peripheral language, as a peripheral custom to allow them to engage in trade, right? Because in Africa, when they were doing the majority of their trading, they were trading with Arabs. So in order for them to effectively do so, they would have to take on the language of those who they were trading with. So they would carry on a lot of those same languages as they moved throughout the globe. It's no different from how Van Sertima mentions that when they came up from the South, they were speaking the language or the lingua franca of the Aztecs, right? They knew they had to trade and barter with the Aztecs. In order to effectively do so, they had to pick up the language. Me saying that that custom is just how these African individuals engage with Arabic. And this is why a lot of these words that you find the cultural confluence with has an Arabic origin, right? So I want to point that out. I'm going to put my notes on pause. We'll transition into our fishbowl. Remember, you have 2 to do per semester. You have 1 time to pass. You could talk about your journal. You could literally read from your journal. You could talk about what was discussed in your breakout rooms, or you could pull from my notes. All that is on the table. Who would like to share, or who would like to volunteer for the fishbowl?
I had a question about the fishbowl.
Yeah.
How do we know how many we've done so far?
I'm writing them down. I would suggest you take a note too. If you have more than 2, that's cool. But once you've done 2, then you're good to go. I believe you have 1 so far, Destiny.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, or does anyone want to volunteer for the fishbowl? If not, I'll just call that random. All right. Diana Ramos, are you prepared to fishbowl?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, thank you, Diana. Alfonso Moran, are you prepared to fishbowl?
Yeah.
Thank you, Alfonso. And Gerson Morales, are you prepared to fishbowl?
Yeah.
Thank you. So we have Gerson, Alfonso, and Diana. Whoever wants to start, it's on you. I could look it up for you, Diana. But somebody can start the fishbowl though. Diana.
I'll start it off.
Thank you.
Okay, so just feel like points that I found really interesting was how you were mentioning the cultural confluence of like the Africans like building temples and having like the indigenous people like join in. I think it's like interesting because like when I would think of like the indigenous people and like their like buildings and stuff, like for example like the Mayans like with the pyramids that they have built, like I would only like relate it to the indigenous people in that country. I wouldn't think that they were like the buildings that are set there like are influenced from Africans. And as far as like the language, the like how the Arab language like got influenced into the African language, but in the previous reading we like also like saw that the Arab takeover in Africa brought damaging developments. So I found it interesting that the Arab language was influenced into the culture.
Good call out, Diana. I think just to kind of touch on that real quick, I think it was more of a strategy, right, by the Africans. Again, like just think about it. If let's just say that if you live in Koreatown, right, and you're trying to do business in Koreatown, it would behoove you to speak Korean because that's going to make your business practices all the more efficient. And I think the same is true for the Africans who adapt this Arabic language and these Arabic customs, excuse me, just so they can kind of make their trade and their business a little bit more pliable. Who's next?
I could go.
Okay.
I could go next. Oh, go for it.
Want me to go?
Yeah, go for it, Alfonso.
Okay. So I'm gonna read my journal entry. So the thesis of this passage was that there are lots of evidence that Mandingo traders were in Mexico. African traders would visit Mexico. The traders had picked up the, na, I don't know that I forgot how to say the language, but the lingua
Wow.
franca of the Aztecs from the settlement in the south. They were able to communicate with the Aztecs. They showed them part of their culture. The Africans gave inspiration to the Aztecs in making their god that they worship, the Amanteca. In Mexico and Mali, they had very similar festivals and cultures found in medieval Mexico by giving us evidence that African people were in the Americas with the indigenous people. This is something that is not taught in school.
So you're breaking up a little bit, but I think I got the gist of it. Thank you, Alfonso. Garrison, you gonna go next?
Yeah. So I mean, I just wanted to say that it's crazy how, you know, like people from Africa were brought here, or brought to like the these countries, you know, and us being like taught that, you know, the Columbus was here before, you know, everyone supposedly in school. And that really changed my mind, because, you know, going from thinking something like most of your life, and then, you know, finding out the truth is something like very, you know, different, and it hits you hard.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Garrison. And I know Khalil said he wanted to jump in the fishbowl also. It's on you, Khalil.
Yeah. I don't know if this counts as fishbowl, but it's like one thing I want clarification on. I think I like either I wasn't paying attention or I disconnected or whatever. But you brought up the sickle cell gene or whatever. I thought that was interesting, but I kind of I didn't see the significance in it, or didn't fully understand why that was you know.
Yeah. And I think that's I'll take that as a fishbowl, right? Like, because a part of your journal is to ask a question. So this is why the sickle cell gene is significant, excuse me. The sickle cell gene is developed in African people to help them fight off malaria, right? By and large, you won't find malaria in the Western hemisphere. Like, you won't find that in the Americas. That's not nothing that you really have to deal with. Right, so it would be no reason for that gene to be produced in indigenous people, because there's no need for them to produce that to fight off malaria. So the only way that that gene would be able to be transmuted into the indigenous people is through the mixing of African and indigenous people, right? So you know, you reproduce those genes and those DNAs and those cells, they come together, which would allow for that sickle cell gene that's predominant in Africans to be found in the indigenous peoples as well. Does that make sense for you, Khalil?
Yeah, actually, I cleared it up a lot. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Good question. One thing I want to do, what I would like to discuss, and part of the reason why I always have this reading in this class is just looking at where Cal State LA is located, right? Who is the predominant demographic of Cal State LA? Even in these classes for Pan-African Studies, if you look who's in here, the majority of them are not African people, right? So to me, it's instructive and it's generative to kind of dive into conversation, dive into materials that show these two communities coexisting, right? And this kind of gets back to the third question in your breakout rooms. How does this information problematize normative understandings of Black and Brown relations, right? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. If you want, I could show a video that kind of speaks to some contemporary Black and brown relations, but I think you guys kind of have a gist of how Black and brown relations are performed in our now, right? And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. Michelle, go ahead and say that out loud, please.
Okay, I just thought it was interesting how both Black and brown people have been involved with one another. Like, I thought like everybody began knowing about each other when everybody was brought to America, but like it's been happening way before. Yeah, found that interesting.
Yeah, and then to add to your point, Michelle, like not only did they come together, but they came together harmoniously, right? It wasn't like they came together was trying to kill each other like we have now. So what changes? How did we get from this to what's going on now? What are your thoughts?
I feel like there has been like a divide, like my community compared to others. There's a lot of stigmas about each other. Like my mom is Mexican, but my dad is Black, but she still has a stigma against Black people. And it's like, I don't know, it's just weird how there's stigmas between both groups, even though we're really similar.
Yeah. And it's really crazy because how does that play on you, right? Like if your mom who's indigenous has negative views on Blackness, which is part of who you are, then I mean, by an effect, she has a negative view on part of you, right? Like how does that play out?
It really messes with my identity. It's like she says like, oh, don't be involved, like I don't want your boyfriend to be like Black, and it's like I am Black, like what does that mean? And then from my dad's side, like my cousins, they're like, oh yeah, like all those Mexicans and all of that, and I'm just like, well, I'm Mexican too. So it's I don't know, it's really weird. It puts me in this weird position, and it's just really weird.
Yeah, I can only imagine some of the difficulties. Hold on. Hey, Carlos, just say that out loud, bro. Because you hear me with a gang of stuff in the text, and I'll be trying to get both. So if you can say that out loud, that would really help. And also, if you can't speak out loud, put it in the chat for everyone to see, so that way we kind of engage what you're saying. It says, did you read out what I put, the similarities of the Mandingos and the morphemes that were also interesting, and how African people came to the Americas and have extended to Central and South America and also the Caribbean? Yeah, and he talks about that, right? He says, you know, they came through all of the Americas, but we're going to focus on Mexico because that's where you see the strongest cultural confluence, right? So to Carlos's point, think about this. Who has the highest concentration of African people outside of Africa? Where in this globe, right? Where in the world is the highest concentration of African people outside of Africa? Carlos says USA. America.
Brazil?
Thank you, Carney. Brazil. Brazil has the highest concentration of African people outside of Africa. And one thing about Brazil, they do a very, I'll say profound to be nice, right? Very profound job of showing the face of Brazil as non-Black. But if you go in the favelas and you go into some of the hoods of Brazil, you'll see a very large Black presence. Yes, Salvador has a very large Afro, what do they call it? Afro-Indigenous culture. Would Guatemala be considered brown because there's a lot of Blacks descendants in Guatemala? I wanted to give a little, yeah, Diana, please speak on that. Speak on what you know about Guatemala.
Yeah, so you said that like there's like differences now, right? So I'm Guatemalan myself, and I have an uncle who was born in Guatemala and everything, but his grandma and I believe his dad as well they are Black descendants. Like there's an island in Guatemala called Livingstone, where a lot of like people from Africa like ended up there. So there's a lot of like Black descendants like just across Guatemala itself. But what I found very like interesting that I just like realized going like back right now, because I just went to Guatemala like last month, but that in Livingstone, that's where the majority of the Black descendants are. Like they're not around like all of Guatemala. Like you don't really see them like anywhere else except for like in that island, which I find very interesting because they're like separated, but they're still there, like in Guatemala. Like they're still part of Guatemala, but they're just separated from like everyone else.
So to piggyback on Diana's point, right? We could go to another part of South America, or the Caribbean islands as well. Haiti, right? What is Haiti's neighboring country? Carlos, I'm getting to that point right now. What is Haiti neighbor? Does anyone know what Haiti's neighboring country is? Like it's one big island, right? And you cut a divide right down the middle. One half is Haiti, the other half is, no one knows?
Is it Cuba?
Carlos, do you know?
Jamaica? I mean, Dominican Republic?
Dominican Republic, right? So literally, when you think of Haiti, you think of what? Black folks, right? When you think of the Dominican Republic, you think of more a Latin influence, right? The only thing that caused Haiti and Dominican Republic to be what it is the French. The French took all the lighter Haitians, right? And said this half of the island is called Dominican. This other half that the Africans liberated, we'll leave that to them, and that's called Haiti, right? Really, there's no difference in those people, except the French coming down and saying this half of the island will be Dominica, this half of the island will be Haitian. That's it. So when Diana talks about how in Guatemala, there's certain isolated and bifurcated communities that are only African, that is something that's proliferated throughout all of South America and Latin America. Dr. Henry Louis Gates out of Harvard has a very brilliant PBS special where he talks about the erased African presence and all throughout Latin and Central America. And I mean, even to the point that there would be Black rulers, Black kings of these ancient South American empires. And over time, they would paint them lighter and lighter and lighter to reimagine them as white or lighter skin, right? So this idea of erasing the Black presence off of the world, that's not just happening in Kemet, right? That's happening throughout the globe. So, and this is why you get this phenomenon to where, you know, even within the indigenous community, you want to shun any elements of Africanity that's there. Let's get two more thoughts and we'll call it a day. Kimberly, what did you think about the reading or the discussion today? Kimberly?
Sorry, I was trying to get my mic to work. I just had a quick question. What exactly like happened after, like, you know how you said like they combined together and they got together to do trade and stuff? So like, so when Christopher Columbus came, did that mean like he just completely wiped that out, or like did they just kind of?
Yeah, a good question. Like, yeah, I mean, so the part of Columbus that don't gets told, right, is the devastation that he caused, the pillaging that he did and the murder that he did. And I think what happens is behind Columbus comes colonialism, comes the transatlantic slave trade, right? So Columbus kind of is one domino that fell that allowed for a lot of the building and the production of what we call modernity, the modern world, right? So essentially, as the Western world that Columbus is representing and bringing to the New World, right? As that gets builds and it kind of establishes its empire, the indigenous world that was there prior to it gets eradicated, swallowed up, and essentially genocide is tried to be enacted upon them. Does that answer your question, Kimberly?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And I also just find it like, it's crazy to think how like the people of color, like we've been so like, there's so many of us, and like the white people try to like kind of wipe us out like slowly, and we always think to ourselves that like we're the minorities, like we're the people who have less people, and we're like, but I feel like we kind of just think that of ourselves now because they like put it onto us and they kind of teach us that that's what it is now. I guess you could say.
Kimberly, were you here the first week of class?
The first classes?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it was like in the first readings. I also remember when the reading where he was saying that like that they would just kind of judge from afar their culture and like not try to learn from it. So I kind of took it as that's what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and I just brought that up, Kimberly, just to kind of, from what you just said, right? It's like, it's crazy how all of us people of culture are kind of the same, right? So that's why I don't allow for us to use the term minority in this course, right? How is it that African people, indigenous people, Arabic people, Asian people are all considered minorities and one group is considered the majority, right? So that's inaccurate. And you're absolutely correct by saying that they get us to think about ourselves this way so we don't realize the power that we have when we're able to come together. And for me, this is exactly why I don't allow us to use that terminology in my course, because it begins us to start thinking differently and begins us to start thinking exactly how you're thinking, Kimberly. It's like, well, shit, if we all come together, we're far from a minority. I know Carlos had a quick question. Okay, a quick question just to clarify, so I can ask this information to my journal. What would be the most? Yeah, that could be some journal information, Carlos. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Is there anyone else that has any questions, comments, or concerns?